So in our last video, we talked about the Articles of Confederation, the strengths, the weaknesses, and how it led to the ratification of the Constitution. Inside of the Constitution, we talked about the specific compromises such as the Great Compromise, the Three-Fifths Compromise, the Electoral College, and the addition of the Bill of Rights in order to actually ratify the document. Now let's break down the structure of the Constitution. So the Constitution has three main parts. You have the Preamble, or the introduction. You have the Articles, which are the main parts that describe how the government is set up. And you have amendments, all right? Additional changes to the document. The Constitution is not a very broad document. It's not very wordy, all right? And that's on purpose, okay? The Constitution is meant to be interpreted and to fit the current climate of America, right? The reason why it's lasted a couple hundred years is because of its ability to be flexible, all right? So just to go through the main parts of the Constitution, the Preamble is the intro. So if you think about it like an essay that you would write in school, the Preamble is your introduction, all right? That's your intro paragraph. The Articles are your body paragraphs, and the amendments are the changes that you make before you finally submit the document, all right? So the Preamble or the intro states the purpose of the document, just like your intro in an essay would state the purpose of your essay. So the first is to form a more perfect union. This is to unite states as they act as a single unit. Under the Articles, right, we have the independent states of America. The Constitution aims to solve that problem by specifically stating that we want to unite the states to act as a single nation. To establish justice, make sure all citizens are treated fairly. To ensure domestic tranquility, to provide peace and order. To promote general welfare, to help people live happy and healthy lives. To provide for the common defense, okay, that is a big one. Making sure that we have a United States military to protect the country, and to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, guaranteeing basic rights to current Americans, but also future Americans, all right? Why the Constitution is one of the most beautiful documents ever crafted is because it still applies today, okay? Written in the late 1700s, it still applies in 2025. That's so impressive, right? The framers of the Constitution had the foresight to understand that the document needed to be able to bend to fit the current mold of America, right? And that's why the Constitution is so impressive. You also have 7 articles in the Constitution. The first 3 give the powers to the federal government, right? So each branch of government. So Article 1 is the legislative branch. Article 2 is the executive branch. Article 3 is the judicial branch, okay? The states, or it states that the House and the Senate will have the lawmaking authorities, okay? So that bicameral legislature will have the ability to make laws. And it describes how each member will be elected and what rules they must follow, all right? So the Constitution is kind of a rule book for the federal government, all right? How it's structured, what their powers are, what they can do, what they can't do. Article 2 is the executive branch, or the law enforcing portion, headed by a president and a vice president, and it explains how these leaders can be elected, okay, or impeached and removed. Article 3 is the judicial branch. It interprets laws and makes sure that laws are applied fairly. Under the Constitution, it says that we will have one Supreme Court and lower courts as Congress determines, all right? So we get this idea of checks and balances here. Yes, we have a Supreme Court, which is the judicial branch, but if you wanted to add more courts, that's the job of the legislature, okay? Congress actually decides how many more courts are added and how to do that. Now, over 1,000 amendments have been proposed, but only 27 have been ratified or approved. The framers knew the Constitution was delicately balanced, right? This is why they made the amendment process difficult. You want some degree of difficulty when you are amending the U.S. Constitution because you want to make sure, absolutely sure, that the majority of the states and the majority of the citizens find the change to the Constitution beneficial. If it was a simple majority, right? If only 26 states had to agree, that leaves a lot of room for kind of like the slight majority to take advantage of the slight minority, all right? A supermajority is necessary because if 75% of states agree to change the Constitution, it probably applies to people in Alaska, in Florida, in Kansas evenly. So amendments allow for changing social conditions. So example, the abolishment of slavery and women's suffrage. So these are big social changes that occurred in the United States throughout history. And the beauty of the Constitution is it fits all of those scenarios, right? When it was ratified originally, right, in the late 1700s, slavery was legal, women couldn't vote, okay? As slavery became less and less popular, okay, The Constitution allowed for people to vote that out of the Constitution to make it illegal, to abolish it. Same thing with women's suffrage. Okay, obviously women have the right to vote now, and because of changes in the social climate, okay, states were able to vote on whether or not to give women the right to vote, and that's what we call women's suffrage. So there's a two-step process for actually changing the Constitution. Okay, the first is the proposal and then the ratification. So proposal can be proposed in two ways: by an act of Congress or by a national convention called by 2/3 of states. Okay, normally this nowadays happens by an act of Congress. And now ratification, once an amendment has been proposed, it must be ratified. How does this happen? 3/4 of the states must ratify the amendment. Ratification can be voted on by state legislature or by special state convention. A lot of times the state legislature will vote on it. So the amendment gets proposed, it gets sent out to all 50 states. Inside of the state legislature, okay, the state legislative branch, they decide whether or not to approve it. If 75% approve, it becomes an amendment. So sometimes we can get unofficial amendments. These are certain actions by the president that unofficially lead to a change in the Constitution. So for example, William Henry Harrison was the first president to die while being the president. His vice president assumed the position, right, as president, or took power from William Henry Harrison, and his name was John Tyler. So what's interesting is the Constitution never actually spelled out what to do if the president dies, right? But logically, it makes sense that the vice president would take over. So there is a bit of logic that has to kind of come in play here. The president passes away. It's pretty obvious that the VP should take over, but that process wasn't actually outlined in the Constitution, right? So the 25th Amendment was ratified, and Tyler's actions were formally made part of the Constitution, right? So we have the presidential succession kind of like actual process outlined in the 25th Amendment, which explains what happens if the president dies, and then the VP dies, and then the Speaker of the House dies, and then all the way down the chain. So the framers knew the world would change. They kept some parts of the document as general as possible. These left matters open for interpretation and explanation. The Constitution is specifically vague, okay? Now, when you hear vague and specific in the same sentence, sometimes it's kind of counterintuitive, but they purposely made it vague. They purposely made it so that the document could be interpreted, all right? Now, the necessary and proper clause allows Congress to use the powers not directly listed in the Constitution, all right? So sometimes we call this the elastic clause. Sometimes we call it the necessary and proper clause. So if you think of a rubber band, right, it's very stretchy, okay? It's elastic. What that does is it allows Congress to stretch its powers, its implied powers. Now, implied powers help Congress carry out their expressed powers. An example of an expressed power is to raise a military, right? Congress has the power to raise a military. Now, it's implied, right? It's not stated, but it's implied that in order to do that, Congress needs things like aircraft carriers and fighter jets, okay? Now, does it say anything in the Constitution about aircraft carriers and fighter jets? Absolutely not, because they didn't exist when the document was written. But it's implied. If you want a strong army, you're going to need those types of technologies, right? The Supreme Court interprets the Constitution, sometimes loosely, sometimes strictly, depending on which justices are sitting in the Supreme Court. And Congress and the President also interpret the Constitution by taking certain actions that are not specified by the document, such as executive orders and things like that. Okay, so let's get into the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, known as the Bill of Rights. So the First Amendment guarantees civil liberties, all right? So when you think of the First Amendment, I want you to think of RAPS, okay? Religion, assembly, petition, press, and speech. Those are your 5 protections under the First Amendment. So what are civil liberties? These are freedoms we have to think and act without interference from the government or without fearing that we'll be treated unfairly. Most civil liberties are protected under the Bill of Rights, and the First Amendment protects 5, okay? The right to practice your religion freely, the right to assemble, okay, to get together, the right to write whatever you want in the press, the right to petition the government, and the right to free speech. Now, there are some limits on these First Amendment protections, okay? Can't incite violence, can't actively pose a threat to the United States government, but generally you can say exactly what you want when you want, and it's important that the First Amendment exists because it allows us to make sure that the federal government is not infringing on our rights. So freedom of religion. This says that Congress cannot establish or support any religion known as the official religion of the United States. Okay, we call this the Establishment Clause, or sometimes it's referred to as the separation of church and state. Americans have the right to practice their faith in any way that they want. The government can't take away this right. Some countries like China put limits on religious activity. They're not the only one. There are a lot of other countries that limit religious activity. All right, but just know in America, you have the right to practice your religion freely. If you remember our Colonial America video, we talk about the Puritans. They came to America specifically for religious freedom, so it's a tenet in American society for sure. Freedom of speech is a big one, all right? Citizens can state their opinion in public or private without fear of being punished from the government. Free speech covers meetings, speeches, lectures, conversations, radio and TV, instant messaging, art, music, clothing, text messages, Instagram DMs, all of that counts as free speech. Now, understand that free speech is not free of consequence, okay? What do I mean by that? Chances are that you will not face any governmental consequences by free speech, right? By saying something, the government isn't going to necessarily interfere with you unless it's an active threat to something, okay? So you can say that you hate America, you can say that you hate the president, okay? All of that is valid and all of that is protected under free speech, all right? Now, when I say that it's not free of consequence, okay? Let's say you're a teacher like me, or you work as a lawyer, or you work as a doctor or something, okay? And you say something outlandish. Your employer might fire you, right? You might lose your job, okay? You might face backlash from your friends and family. So there is, although speech is protected, okay? We're really talking about in context of the government, all right? The government can't really do much to you based on what you say. That doesn't mean your friends and family can't. That doesn't mean that your employer can't. So that's very important when we're talking about free speech. Freedom of the press. The government can't censor news reports, okay? So if you want to talk poorly about the government, you absolutely can. Censorship is banning printed materials or films because they have harming or alarming or offensive ideas. Can't prevent information from being public or published. Press refers to printed materials such as books, newspapers, and magazines. And Americans have a chance to hear a range of news and views on public issues. Now, you want kind of both sides of the argument, right, in order to make the best decision. This is the intent of the freedom of the press, is to make sure that Americans are as informed as possible and can make the best decision based on their experience in their life. Okay, freedom of assembly protects the right to gather in groups for any reason as long as the groups are peaceful. This is a very, very hot topic in 2025. What is assembly that is legal and what is assembly that is not legal, okay? So again, there are limits to this. You can't just get a group of people together and go protest climate change on the runway of Tampa International Airport, right? That's illegal, okay? Can you, though, get a permit from the city and have some sort of demonstration down at Curtis Hickson Park? Absolutely you can, okay? There are still limits to the freedom of assembly, but you are allowed to assemble without interference from the government as long as your assembly is peaceful, okay, it's nonviolent, and it's not interfering with other people's rights. So to petition the government is a formal request for the government to do something, okay? It's a written statement, an email, maybe it's a letter to a government official, and this gives us the right to express ourselves to the government. It also lets the government know that there's support behind an idea. A lot of times our politicians are disconnected from the actual day-to-day life of the people that they represent. So a good way to get their attention is to fill something out kind of like a petition, right? This just lets those government officials know that there is support behind a specific idea. Okay, there are some limits on civil liberties. So it was never intended to allow citizens to do whatever they want. Rights of the individual must be balanced against the rights of others. Rights of the individual must be also balanced with the rights of the community. Okay, so for example, you're allowed to play your music loud, right, in your own house. But if you're doing it at 2 o'clock in the morning and you're disrupting your entire neighborhood, right, your neighbor's rights supersede yours, okay? They're more important than yours, okay? So just know that. It's not an absolute right. So free speech limitations, okay? You can't spread lies that will harm someone's reputation. This is known as slander. So spoken is slander, all right? You can't print lies about a person. Libel is literature. So written or spoken lies are slander, S and S. Libel is literature, it's written. Can't speak in a way that directly leads to criminal acts, okay? And can't speak or write in a way that aims to overthrow the U.S. government. Pretty valid, I would argue. So your Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments are known as the right, and the Eighth Amendment are known as the rights of the accused. Okay, and these amendments protect you if you're accused of wrongdoing. So the Fourth Amendment protects against unlawful searches and seizures. Okay, police officers can't just kind of like search your house or your car without probable cause. What is probable cause? It's strong reasons to think that a person was involved in a crime. In order to search a property, a judge must issue what is called a search warrant, and a search warrant is a court order that allows police officers to search private property. All right, so the Fourth Amendment protects you against unlawful searches and seizures. The Fifth Amendment says you can't be tried for a crime without an indictment. So what is an indictment? It's a grand jury issued doc that formally charges somebody with a crime. Double jeopardy. You can't put somebody on trial for a crime of which he or she has be found innocent. All right. So let's say you get arrested for robbing a gas station. Okay. And the reason why you got arrested was because you were wearing a red shirt, and the person that wore the red shirt, okay, or the person that robbed the gas station was wearing a red shirt. So the cops see you walking down the street. You have a red shirt on. The person that robbed the store that has a red shirt on. They arrest you. They put you in jail. You go on trial, right? And you're found innocent, okay? What they cannot do is rearrest you and retry you for that exact crime on that exact day. Now, if 2 weeks later you actually do go ahead and rob a gas station, okay? It's not double jeopardy for them to arrest you and put you back on trial because it's a separate instance. So what double jeopardy does is it protects you from being tried over and over and over and over again for the same exact instance, okay? Everybody has the right to remain silent. This protects people from self-incrimination. So if you ever heard one of those cop shows, them saying you have the right to remain silent, they're talking about the Fifth Amendment. Due process is very important. It's a set of legal procedures that must be followed if reasonable. And then eminent domain. It's the government's right to take away property for public use. So if your house happens to be in the path of a new highway being built, the government can theoretically, under eminent domain, take away your property, pay you a fair market for fair market value for the house, take away your property, build the highway. The Sixth Amendment requires a person to know what they're being charged with. Also a trial by jury. So the accused may waive this right. If you want to just be tried by the judge, you can. They also guarantee a speedy and public trial, which should be held in the community where the crime took place. Right to hear and question the witnesses against them. So if somebody is testifying against you, you have the right to question them. Right to call witnesses in your defense. So if you have people that can prove that you are not guilty or were not at the scene of the crime, you have the right to do that. And you also have the right to a lawyer, which again, you can waive if you'd like. The Eighth Amendment, all right, talks about bail and forbids cruel and unusual punishment. So what bail is a sum of money used as a security deposit, all right? So you get arrested, you get put out on bail, you give them the court a certain amount of money, and you get that money back when you show up for your trial. This forbids cruel and unusual punishment as well. And many Americans debate what counts as cruel and unusual. So hanging you upside down from your toenails or something might be a cruel punishment for stealing a pack of gum from a gas station. Also, the bail has to kind of fit the crime. So again, if you did steal a pack of gum from a gas station, right, bail probably won't be $1 million. But if you kill somebody, you might not get bail. You probably won't get bail. If you steal a car, maybe your bail is $100,000. So the bail has to fit the crime and, again, protects against cruel and unusual punishment. So the Second, Third, and Seventh Amendment. The second is the right to bear arms, so you are allowed to possess a firearm as an American citizen. Okay? Individuals can own guns, but government can pass laws to control it. So, for example, gun laws in Florida are a lot different than gun laws in New York. Gun laws in Wyoming are a lot different than in Los Angeles. So you probably don't need a semi-automatic weapon in Los Angeles, but you might need one in Wyoming to protect your farm. Right? So the local governments, the state governments get to decide what that means, but you do have the right to possess a firearm as an American. So the third, which is my favorite in a way because I think it's so funny. So soldiers may not stay in people's homes without permission, all right? So the Third Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, right? The third most important thing that the framers thought about was not allowing soldiers to stay in their house. This was very popular during the Revolutionary War. So it was obviously still on the minds of the framers of the Constitution. And they said, listen, soldiers are not allowed to stay in your house without your permission. Seventh gives you protections in civil cases, such as the right to a trial by jury. for disputes of property above $20 or more. Judges have the duty to solve issues of law, and judges can determine which evidence is allowed. A vocabulary word would be admissible, okay, and that just means what evidence is allowed. So when you go through the Bill of Rights, you can kind of see the priorities of the framers of the Constitution. Obviously, individual rights and liberties in the First Amendment. Second Amendment is allowing Americans to own guns, okay, to protect themselves from a tyrannical government. The third is the funny one, quartering, okay, not allowing soldiers to stay in your house. Fifth is your, due process. Sixth, seventh, and so on. Now, the Ninth and 10th Amendments are kind of one and the same, okay? All rights not spelled out in the Constitution are retained or kept by the people. So everything that is not listed in the Constitution as a power for the federal government belongs to the states and the people. This prevents the government from claiming that the only rights people have are those listed in the Bill of Rights. Citizens have rights obviously beyond those listed in the Constitution. So the 10th talks about the power of the federal government and how it's limited. Okay? Any powers the Constitution does not specifically give to the federal government belong to the states, and this intends to prevent Congress and the president from becoming too strong. So instead of listing everything every right and responsibility and power that the people have, instead we just list what the federal government has, and whatever the federal government doesn't have gets put on the states and the people. A couple of more important amendments here are known as the Civil Rights Amendments. So the Civil War Amendments, 3 amendments crafted in the mid-1800s aimed to give more rights to African Americans. So 1860, 1861, 11 states tried to leave the Union to form a new country. This is known as the Civil War. Okay, the Civil War was fought over whether or not the states could leave the Union. A lot of people think that it's fought over slavery. Kind of. It's more about preserving the United States of America or the Union. The South loses and slavery is officially abolished. And although these amendments were passed, unfair treatment of African Americans did not end. Okay? Not until the 1900s, African Americans were able to enjoy their rights guaranteed by these Civil War amendments. So the 13th Amendment, approved after the Civil War, okay, this outlawed slavery. So 13th Amendment abolished slavery. This freed hundreds of African Americans, banned forced labor unless a crime is committed. So what this means is prisoners can work in prisons and workshops, and judges can sentence somebody to community service, but you can't force people to work against their will if they haven't committed a crime. The 14th Amendment, all right, although the 13th ended slavery, it didn't guarantee full rights. So the southern states are going to pass what are called black codes, and these are designed to keep African Americans from holding certain jobs, having few property rights, and limited rights in other ways. So this is what the 14th Amendment aimed to do. It was approved to protect African Americans from these laws. States that an American citizen is anyone born or naturalized in the U.S. So by giving citizenship rights to African Americans, southern states can no longer treat them any different than other Americans. Stated that every state must provide equal protection under the law for all citizens, and this aimed again to outlaw the unfair treatment of African Americans. So the 13th abolishes slavery, 14th extends citizenship rights. It also aimed to help other people who were unequally treated, such as women and disabled people, forbade the states from interfering with rights of the citizens, and states could not take a person's life, liberty, or property unless they follow due process. Again, one of those Fifth Amendment protections. So the 4th and the 5th are kind of one and the same. At first, the Bill of Rights thought to only apply to the federal government, but Gitlow versus New York decided that due process protects free speech and free press from state law. Okay, so originally we thought that all of these amendments only applied at the federal level, and the states could kind of do what they want. Not unfortunately. Fortunately, okay, the states also have to kind of like follow what the United States Constitution says, right? This is known as the Supremacy Clause, basically saying that whatever the federal government says, the states have to follow. And Due Process Clause requires states to protect and respect the First Amendment rights. Okay, so 1870, we have the 15th Amendment. No state may deny a person the right to vote based on race, okay? So 15th Amendment gives voting rights to African-American males at the time, okay? Because it's not 1920 yet. We don't have the 19th Amendment. So aim to guarantee suffrage for African-American men. Suffrage just means the right to vote. States have the power to decide whether women can vote, and most states did not grant that right for women for many decades until 1920, like we talked about. So the 19th Amendment used the power set aside for citizens in the 10th, basically allowing states to make their own laws on women's suffrage or women's right to vote. In 1840, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony campaigned for women's suffrage. They are known as suffragists. Wyoming was the first state to give women the right to vote. And in 1920, the 19th Amendment was passed, and this gave rights to American women and allowed them to vote. Okay? So the 13th, abolished slavery. 14th, citizenship rights. 15th was voting rights for African Americans. 19th is voting rights for women. The 23rd Amendment, okay, so this has to deal with Washington, D.C. D.C. is weird because it's not a state, right? So it doesn't have all of the protections that states have. So citizens living in D.C. were denied full voting rights because they weren't a part of a state. D.C. is an area between Virginia and Maryland. Since it's not a state, people couldn't vote. The 23rd Amendment allows D.C. And residents in D.C. to vote for president and vice president. They would receive the same amount of electoral votes as the smallest state, so they would receive 3. And residents still don't have like a voting rep in Congress. So all the 23rd does is allows residents of Washington, D.C. to vote for president and vice president. So southern states still found a way to block African Americans from voting, even after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. And mostly this was through poll taxes, okay? And this was meant to suppress African American voting. A poll tax is a fee that was required to vote in an election. So African Americans and anybody who was poor had to actually pay money, right? And if you're poor, you can't afford it. So the 24th Amendment, this is 1964, made poll taxes illegal, and the Supreme Court banned poll taxes in state elections under the 24th Amendment. So the last thing that we're going to cover in this video are the major principles of government and some vocabulary words that will definitely be on your FCLE and your EOC at the end of the year. So we have a couple of major principles of government which we're going to get into. Okay, popular sovereignty, limited government and rule of law, separation of powers, checks and balances, and federalism. These are things that you all need to know. Popular sovereignty, right? Popular sounds like population, all right? Sovereignty is freedom. So the idea that the power of the government lies within the people. Okay, sovereignty is the right to rule. Most citizens exercise their vote or their will by voting in elections. So popular sovereignty is the idea that the government gets their power from the people. Never forget that your politicians that you vote for work for you, okay? You are their constituents. You are the people that are putting them in power. They don't get that power unless you vote for them, all right? That is the idea of popular sovereignty. Limited government and rule of law. So framers believed in a strong but not too strong federal government, as we spoke about in the last video. What limited government is, it basically says the government can only do what the people allow it to do, okay? A lot of times, governments are limited by a constitution in both the federal and the state government, and the government is also limited by the rule of law. The rule of law states that the law applies to everybody, even those who govern, okay? People like presidents, senators, people in the Supreme Court. No one may break the law, not even at those at the highest levels of government, all right? People like the president. So this is meant to prevent tyranny and protect the rights of the people. You don't want people that have power to be able to break the law. That's just not the way it goes. That's unconstitutional, right? It goes against the Constitution, specifically because of the idea of limited government. Separation of powers, right? Meant to protect citizens against abuse or misuse of power. Aims to prevent any person or group from gaining too much power. The framers divided the federal government into 3 branches, okay, with different tasks. Okay, this was from Baron de Montesquieu, okay, or Enlightenment thinker Montesquieu. Montesquieu believed that the separation of powers would protect liberties, and this system limited any branch from becoming too powerful. So I want to go over the difference between separation of powers and checks and balances. The idea of separation of powers is just that. It's an idea, okay? Let's take power and divide it. Let's put it in 3 separate branches, okay? Checks and balances is actually the actions that each of these branches can take to make sure that one doesn't gain too much power. So separation of powers is the idea, okay? Split the power up. Checks and balances are the actions that make sure that one branch doesn't gain too much power over the other, okay? And again, aiming to prevent one branch from getting power over the other. Each branch has the ability to check. What we mean by check is to limit the power of the other 2 branches. So federalism, another extremely important vocab word. We talked about federalists in the last video, right? Those who favored a strong federal government. Now, federalism is the idea that power is shared and divided between a federal government and a state government, okay? Remember we talked about the flaws of the Articles, obviously the flaws of the King in England, and how the Constitution kind of like took the best of both worlds and put it in the middle, okay? That is the idea of federalism. Federal powers, state powers, sometimes they share them, sometimes they're divided. So each level of government, national and state, have independent authority over the people at the same time. You have three types of power. Enumerated power, these are powers granted directly to the federal government. Reserved powers, these are powers for the states. And you have concurrent powers, okay, powers that are shared. So you have federal power, you have reserved power, okay, and you have concurrent power. The Supremacy Clause, this is in Article 5, states that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. States can't go against the Constitution, can't go against the national government, and the national government can't go against the Constitution, okay? So the Supremacy Clause is very, very important. What it says is the Constitution is the highest law of the land, then you have your federal government, and then you have your state government, okay? Nothing can violate the Constitution, states can't violate the federal, and then you have your state governments,